Throughout history, people have often waited for salvation to arrive wrapped in spectacle, a towering figure, unmistakable authority, strength that announces itself before a single word is spoken. Yet when we look closely at the stories preserved in ancient writings, a very different pattern emerges. Again and again, divine purpose unfolds through lives that attract no attention at all, through individuals without rank or recognition, through people who carry no visible sign of importance, whose lives quietly challenge our assumptions about what real power should be. This is the account of one such man. His name was Aud. He lived in an era when his nation was burdened by foreign rule, when hope had thinned to almost nothing, and freedom felt like a memory from another age. He held no throne. He spoke no prophecies. His name was not sung by warriors or remembered in triumph. He was simply a man marked by a single, easily dismissed detail, something most would never consider significant. Yet that very detail would become the turning point through which deliverance came. Tonight we step into the age of the judges, a turbulent period marked by repetition, failure, and renewal. A time when Israel learned over and over that true strength rarely appears in the forms people expect. Here we encounter a man who understood that faithfulness outweighs appearances, and that God often advances his purposes through those the world overlooks. Human history has always been shaped by labels, by systems that decide who matters, whose voice deserves to be heard, and who can safely be ignored. These judgments are built on familiar ideas of strength, leadership, our incapability, and most of the time they remain unquestioned, forming the lens through which reality itself is interpreted. But every so often that lens shatters. Someone steps forward who fits none of the categories, meets none of the expectations, and seems wholly unqualified for the task set before them, and yet succeeds, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. Ode was such a person, and though his story is brief, the truths it carries have echoed through centuries. Truths about power, about the way God moves in the world, and about what it means to be chosen for a purpose that appears, by every human measure, impossible. The night is quiet, the story is ready. Let us begin. Chapter 1. Israel under oppression. The era of the judges was not a time of stability. It was a time of repetition, a cycle that turned with grim predictability. Israel would fall into disobedience. They would worship gods that were not their own. They would forget the covenant that had defined them. And then inevitably, they would find themselves under the rule of foreign powers, their freedom stripped away, their land no longer their own. This cycle had turned many times by the time entered the story. The people had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord. They had turned away. And so the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, and gave him power over Israel. Understanding this requires understanding the geography and politics of the ancient Near East. Moab was not a distant empire. It was a neighboring kingdom located east of the Dead Sea in territory that bordered Israel directly. The Moabites were descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew, which meant there was a distant kinship between them and the Israelites. But kinship did not prevent conflict. In fact, proximity and shared history often intensified rivalries rather than softening them. Eglon was not a minor ruler. His name appears in the biblical text with a certain weight, a certain presence. He was a king who had successfully consolidated power, who had managed to unite not just the Moabites, but also the Ammonites and the Amalekites in a coalition against Israel. This was no small feat. These were peoples with their own histories, their own grievances, their own territorial ambitions. To bring them together required political skill, military strength, and strategic vision. The coalition came against Israel and defeated them. The text does not detail the battles, does not describe the tactics or the casualties. It simply records the outcome. Defeat. Israel, the nation that had once crossed the Jordan with miraculous power, that had seen the walls of Jericho fall, that had been promised the land as an inheritance. This Israel was defeated by a coalition of neighboring peoples and placed under tribute. They took the city of palms. This was almost certainly Jericho, the ancient city that had been the first conquest of Joshua's campaign. The symbolism would not have been lost on anyone. The very city that represented Israel's initial victory in the Promised Land was now held by their enemies. What had been taken by faith was lost through faithlessness. From this stronghold, Eglon ruled, and Israel served him for 18 years. Think about what 18 years means in the life of a nation. It is long enough for an entire generation to come of age knowing only subjugation. Children born in the first year of Moabite rule would be adults by the time deliverance came. They would have no memory of freedom, no experience of self-determination. Their entire understanding of what it meant to be Israelite would be shaped by the reality of foreign dominance. 18 years is also long enough for systems to calcify, for the mechanisms of oppression to become routine, for both the oppressed and the oppressor to settle into their roles, to accept them as the natural order of things. Tribute payments become expected. Checkpoints become normal. The presence of foreign soldiers becomes part of the landscape. Hope in such circumstances does not disappear all at once. It erodes slowly year by year until one day people realize they have stopped imagining that things could be different. They have stopped telling stories about the past with longing. They have stopped praying with expectation. They have simply adapted. But suffering has a way of accumulating. Even when people have learned to live with oppression, even when they have made peace with diminished expectations, something builds beneath the surface. Resentment, exhaustion, a deep, wordless grief that cannot be fully suppressed, and eventually that accumulation reaches a breaking point. Israel cried out to the Lord. The text does not tell us what form this cry took. Was it a spontaneous uprising of prayer? Was it a formal gathering? A day of fasting and repentance? Was it simply the collective groan of a people who had nothing left to lose? We do not know, but we know the cry was heard. The Lord, who had allowed the oppression as a consequence of Israel's disobedience, did not turn away from their cry. He heard, and hearing, he acted. He began to prepare a deliverer. This is how God works, not by ignoring consequences, not by preventing suffering that comes from human choice, but by remaining present in the suffering, by hearing the cry even when it comes late, by preparing even in the midst of oppression the means of deliverance. The deliverer was already among them, living a quiet life unknown, unrecognized, shaped by circumstances he likely did not understand. His name was Ehud. Chapter 2. The left-handed man. The deliverer's name was Ehud, son of Gera, a Benjam. He was not a man of prominence. There are no records of his exploits before this moment. No songs sung in his honor, no battles won in his name. He was simply a man from the tribe of Benjamin, and he had one detail about him that the text records with peculiar care. He was left-handed. In the ancient world, this was more than a physical trait. It was a marker of difference. Most people were right-handed. The entire material culture was built around this assumption. Tools were designed for right-handed use. Weapons were worn on the left side, drawn with the right hand. Soldiers were trained accordingly. Guards knew where to look. Expectations were built around the norm. Ehud did not fit the norm. The Hebrew phrase used to describe him is even more specific than our English translations often convey. It does not simply say he was left-handed. It says he was Yemen, which literally means restricted in his right hand or bound in his right hand. This phrase suggests not just a preference for the left hand, but possibly a limitation or disability in the right hand. Some scholars have interpreted this to mean a hood may have had a paralyzed or withered right hand, making left-handedness not a choice, but a necessity. To the world around him, this would have been seen as a disadvantage. In a culture that valued physical perfection, that saw certain physical traits as signs of divine favor and others as marks of curse or weakness, a man with a disabled right hand would have been marginalized. He would have been considered less capable, less threatening, less likely to be chosen for important tasks, especially tasks involving combat or confrontation. But God does not measure capability the way the world does. There is something profound in this detail being recorded at all. The biblical text is remarkably economical with biographical information. Most figures are introduced with minimal description, a name, a tribal affiliation, perhaps a father's name. The fact that a hood's left-handedness is mentioned suggests it was significant, not incidental, not merely interesting. Significant. This significance would become clear later. But even now, at the moment of introduction, it tells us something important about how God chooses his instruments. The Lord raised up a hood as a deliverer. This phrase, raised up, is used repeatedly in the book of Judges. It indicates divine selection and empowerment. God did not simply allow a hood to act. He specifically chose a hood, raised him up, set him apart for this purpose. Why a hooded? Of all the men in Israel, why this one? Why not a warrior with a reputation? Why not a tribal leader with established authority? Why not someone whose very presence would inspire confidence in a population desperate for deliverance? The answer lies in the principle that runs throughout Scripture. God's strength is made perfect in weakness. What the world considers a disadvantage, God transforms into a strategic advantage. What appears to be a limitation becomes the key to success. Ahaz's left-handedness meant he was underestimated. It meant guards would not be watching for a threat from him. It meant he could move through spaces and situations that would have been close to someone who fit the profile of a warrior. It meant he could hide a weapon where no one would think to look. But more than tactical advantage, a hood selection reveals something about God's character. He does not choose people based on their resume. He does not require them to meet worldly standards of qualification. He looks for something else entirely, something that has to do with the heart, with faithfulness, with the willingness to act in obedience even when the odds seem impossible. Ehud did not announce himself. He did not begin a public campaign. He did not gather supporters or issue declarations. He simply moved forward in the role that had been given to him with a clarity that comes only from divine calling. The world saw a left-handed man, possibly disabled, certainly unremarkable. God saw a tool perfectly shaped for the task ahead. This is the mystery of divine selection. It confounds human wisdom. It bypasses human systems of evaluation. It reaches past the obvious choices and selects the overlooked, the unexpected, the unlikely. And it works. Chapter 3. The Tribute Mission. Israel was required to pay tribute to King Eglon. This was the way of occupation, the mechanism by which dominance was maintained. The conquered people provided wealth to the conquering king. Grain, livestock, precious metals, whatever the terms of subjugation demanded. This was not simply taxation, it was a ritual of submission, a regular reminder of who held power and who did not. The tribute system served multiple purposes. Economically, it extracted wealth from the occupied territory, enriching the occupier and impoverishing the occupied. Politically, it reinforced hierarchy. Each payment was an acknowledgement of defeat, a re-ratification of the power structure. Psychologically, it was devastating. Every time the tribute was collected and delivered, the people were forced to confront their own powerlessness. They were forced to watch resources they had labored to produce being carried away to benefit their oppressor, and it was not optional. Failure to pay tribute would mean military retaliation, more violence, more death. So the tribute was paid year after year, a steady hemorrhaging of wealth and dignity. On this occasion, Ehud was chosen to deliver the tribute. The selection of Ode for this task was on the surface unremarkable. Someone had to deliver the tribute. It required a degree of trustworthiness. This was valuable cargo, and Israel needed to ensure it actually reached its destination rather than being stolen or diverted. It required someone who could navigate the journey safely, who understood protocols, who could interact appropriately with Moabite officials. They who apparently met these criteria. Perhaps he had served in administrative roles before. Perhaps his tribal affiliation made him suitable. Perhaps, and this is more speculative, his physical condition made him seem safe. A man who appeared to have a disabled right hand would not be seen as a threat, would not raise suspicion. Whatever the reason, Ehud was chosen, and he accepted the assignment. But Ehud had prepared something that was not routine, something that no one else knew about, something that would transform a mundane administrative task into the pivot point of national deliverance. He made for himself a double-edged blade. The text describes this weapon with unusual precision. It was a sword, but not the kind typically carried by warriors. It was a cubit in length, roughly 18 inches, the distance from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger. Short, compact, designed not for battlefield combat, but for close quarters, for concealment. A double-edged blade was significant. Single-edged weapons were common. Knives, daggers used for utilitarian purposes as much as for fighting. But a double-edged blade was specifically a weapon. It had no other purpose. It was designed to cut on both the forward thrust and the return draw, maximizing lethality in confined spaces. Hurd made this blade himself. He did not commission it from a blacksmith, did not purchase it from an armorer. He crafted it personally, which suggests several things. First, that he possessed the skill to do so. Metalwork was a specialized craft, not something everyone could do. Second, that he wanted to keep the weapon's existence secret. Third, that he understood exactly what he would need for the task ahead, and then he strapped it to his right thigh under his clothing. This was the stroke of brilliance that made everything else possible. In that culture, weapons were worn on the left side. A right-handed warrior would strap his sword to his left hip, allowing him to draw it across his body with his right hand. Guards checking for weapons knew this. They knew where to look, where to search, what patterns to expect. A blade on the right thigh was wrong, backwards, counterintuitive. A right-handed person wearing a weapon there would find it awkward to draw, would telegraph the motion, would lose precious seconds in any confrontation. But Ode was not right-handed for him. A blade on his right thigh was perfectly positioned. His left hand could reach it naturally, draw it smoothly, bring it into action without the awkward cross-body motion that would be required of a right-handed person. The guards, if they searched him at ball, would check his left side. They would pat down the place where weapons were supposed to be. They would miss the right side entirely, not out of incompetence, but because their expectations shaped their perception. They were looking for what should be there. They were blind to what should not be there, but was. This is the advantage of being underestimated. This is what it means to turn difference into strategic asset. Ehud understood something profound. People see what they expect to see. Reality is filtered through assumption. And someone who violates assumptions can move through the world in ways that confound surveillance, that bypass security, that achieve what should be impossible. Ehud traveled with the delegation to King Eglon. The journey would have taken several days depending on the exact location of Eglon's residence. The text mentions the city of palms, which suggests Jericho, but also references passing by the stone quarries near Gilgal, which provide some geographical markers. The journey was uneventful. A group of Israelites carrying tribute to their Moabite overlord was a common sight. They would not have been harassed. The tribute was expected. Its safe arrival was in everyone's interest. When they arrived, the presentation was formal. There were protocols for such interactions. The tribute would have been inventoried, verified, accepted. Words would have been exchanged, probably ritual phrases acknowledging the relationship between giver and receiver, between subject and king. Eglon received what was owed to him. He accepted the tribute. He fulfilled his role in the transaction. And as far as he knew, that was the end of it. Another successful extraction. Another confirmation of his power. Another routine day in the life of a king who had ruled over occupied territory for nearly 2 decades. Ehud and the others prepared to leave. They gathered their empty carts and containers. They assembled for the return journey and they departed. But then Ehud did something no one anticipated. Chapter 4. The Private Audience. After the tribute had been presented, after the delegation had left and begun their journey home, Ehud separated from the group. He sent them on ahead. He told them to continue without him, that he would catch up later. The text does not record what reason he gave, what explanation satisfied their curiosity. Perhaps he said he had forgotten something. Perhaps he claimed to have remembered another message he needed to deliver. Perhaps they did not question him at all. He was part of the delegation leadership, and his decisions would have carried authority. Whatever he told them, they left. And Od turned back. He returned to the place where King Eglon held court. He approached the palace or fortress where the king conducted his business. And he made a request that was both simple and calculated. He said he had a secret message for the king. The word translated as secret in many English versions carries connotations of both privacy and importance. It suggests information that is sensitive, that must be conveyed discreetly, that is not meant for general knowledge. In the political context of the ancient Near East, such messages were common. Kings received intelligence constantly, reports of plots, warnings of threats, offers of alliance, revelations of conspiracy. Information was currency. Secrets were valuable. For an Israelite to claim he had a secret message for the Moabite king was unusual, but not impossible. Perhaps he had learned something during his time in Israelite territory. Perhaps he was offering information about dissent among his own people. Perhaps he was proposing some kind of deal. The possibilities were numerous enough that the claim itself would not immediately seem suspicious. Eglon responded to this claim with interest. He commanded silence, and he ordered his attendants to leave. The courtiers, guards, servants, everyone present in the throne room or audience chamber were dismissed. The king wanted privacy. He wanted to hear this secret message without interference, without witnesses who might later gossip or misconstrue or use the information for their own purposes. This decision reveals something about Eglon's character and his situation. A king who was truly secure, who trusted his inner circle completely, might have allowed close advisors to remain. But Eglon cleared the room entirely. This suggests either that he was naturally secretive, or that he trusted no one fully, or that he wanted the freedom to respond to whatever information he was about to receive without needing to manage the perceptions of others. It also suggests a kind of arrogance. Eglon apparently felt no physical threat from Ehud. Why would he? Ehud was an Israelite, yes, but he was alone. He was unarmed as far as anyone could tell. He had presumably been checked when he first entered with the tribute delegation. Or at minimum, He had passed through areas where guards would have observed him. He was left-handed, possibly disabled in his right hand, certainly not presenting as a warrior. What possible danger could he pose to a king surrounded by his own guards in his own palace, in his own conquered territory? So Eglon dismissed everyone. The doors closed. The room became quiet. Ehud and Eglon were alone. The text tells us that Eglon was a very fat man. This detail appears both here and later in the narrative, and its inclusion is significant. In the ancient world, obesity in a ruler often signified wealth and prosperity, the ability to eat well while others labored. It was in some contexts almost a status symbol, but it also signified vulnerability. A fat man would be slow, less mobile, less able to defend himself if attacked suddenly. The room was arranged as audience chambers typically were. The king would have been seated, probably on some kind of raised platform or throne. Ah would have been standing before him, lower in the position of a petitioner or messenger. The space between them would have been small. These were not vast halls, but functional rooms designed for meetings and administrative work. Hood stood there looking at the man who had oppressed his people for 18 years, the man who had extracted tribute from Israelite labor, the man who represented everything that had gone wrong in Israel's relationship with God and with their neighbors, the man whose death would change everything. And Eglon sat there waiting to hear whatever secret this Israelite had brought him. Perhaps he was curious. Perhaps he was calculating what advantage this information might give him. Perhaps he was simply bored, and this interruption of routine was mildly interesting. Neither man knew that this was the moment, the fulcrum point, the instant where history would turn. Hood prepared to speak. Chapter 5. The moment of action. A Hood stepped closer. The movement would have seemed natural. Someone about to share a secret would naturally reduce the distance between speaker and listener, would lower their voice, would create the physical intimacy that secrecy requires. He spoke carefully, his voice calm, his words deliberate. "I have a message from God for you." The phrase was perfectly chosen. In that culture, in that time, a message from God was not something to be dismissed lightly. Even a foreign king, even a man who worshipped different deities would recognize the gravity of such a claim. The gods spoke through prophets, through oracles, through chosen messengers. To claim to carry a message from the divine was to invoke the highest possible authority. Eglon may have leaned forward. He may have stilled himself, focusing entirely on what he was about to hear. Perhaps he expected prophecy. Perhaps he expected a warning or a promise. Perhaps he was skeptical but intrigued. We will never know what he expected, because in that moment of attention, in that instant when all of his focus was on Ehud's words, Ehud acted. And with his left hand, he reached to his right thigh. His fingers found the hilt of the blade hidden beneath his garments. In one smooth motion, he drew the weapon and drove it forward into the king's belly. The movement was practiced, efficient. There was no hesitation, no visible struggle. The blade entered the king's body with the force of purpose, penetrating deep, finding no resistance until the hilt itself pressed against flesh. The text records this with stark clinical precision. The blade went in so deep that the hilt followed it, disappearing into the wound. The fat closed over both blade and hilt, and Ehud did not withdraw the weapon. He left it there, embedded in the king's body, and stepped back. This is not a moment the text asks us to celebrate. It is not described with triumph or satisfaction. It simply states what happened. This was an execution, swift, brutal, necessary for the deliverance Audi's up to accomplish, but not something to be glorified for its own sake. Eglon fell. The man who had ruled over Israel for 18 years, who had extracted tribute and maintained occupation, who had been powerful enough to unite multiple peoples in coalition against his neighbors. This man collapsed, mortally wounded, unable even to call for help before consciousness left him. And Ehud did not linger. He did not pause to watch the king die. He did not allow himself a moment of reflection or relief or doubt. He moved with the same steady focus that had brought him this far. He turned toward the doors of the upper room. These doors could be locked from the inside or the outside, a common security feature that allowed for privacy, or in this case, concealment. Hood opened them, stepped through, and pulled them shut behind him. Then he locked them from the outside. This action bought him the time he needed. The locked doors would tell a story to anyone who approached. They would suggest that the king had locked himself in, that he desired continued privacy, that he should not be disturbed. In a culture that respected royal prerogative, that understood the need for discretion in political affairs, such locked doors would not immediately raise alarm. Ehud walked away from the room. He moved through the palace or fortress with the same calm demeanor he had maintained throughout. A man who has just delivered a message to the king, a man completing his business, a man who has every right to be there and no reason to hurry. He passed guards, he passed servants, he passed through checkpoints and courtyards and no one stopped him. Why would they? He was known. He had been part of the tribute delegation, and he was leaving just as he had every right to do. Ehud exited the complex and began walking toward Israelite territory. His pace was steady, not rushed, not furtive, just the normal gait of someone with somewhere to be. Behind him in the locked upper room, King Eglon lay dead. Chapter 6. The Escape. The locked doors continued to protect Hood's escape for longer than might seem possible, but the psychology of the situation worked in his favor. Servants and guards who returned to the area where the king had been would have seen the locked doors and made assumptions. The king had asked for privacy to receive a secret message. He had dismissed everyone from the room. Now the doors were locked. The most natural interpretation was that the king wished to continue in privacy, perhaps to think about what he had learned, perhaps to rest, perhaps to attend to personal needs. In that culture, as in many cultures, there was a reluctance to disturb a monarch unnecessarily. Royal displeasure was something to be avoided, so they waited. Minutes passed, perhaps a quarter hour, perhaps longer. The text tells us that they waited until they were embarrassed, until the length of time had become so extended that continued waiting seemed foolish. That concern began to override deference. Finally, someone made the decision to check. They retrieved a key. The fact that a key was needed suggests these were substantial doors with real locks, not just latches, and they opened the door. What they found was catastrophic. Their king lay dead on the floor of the upper room. The manner of his death was obvious. The weapon was still in his body. The blood had pooled. There could be no doubt about what had happened. The alarm went up immediately. Guards mobilized. Servants scattered to spread the word. The entire complex erupted into chaos. Commands were shouted. Questions were asked. Who had done this? When had it happened? Where was the assassin? The last person known to have been with the king was the Israelite who had claimed to have a secret message. Where was he? When had he left? Which direction had he gone? But by this time, Ehud had a substantial head start. The delay caused by the locked doors had given him time to create distance to move beyond the immediate reach of any pursuit, and he had moved intelligently, not in a panicked flight, but in a deliberate progression towards safety. The text tells us he passed by the stone quarries near Gilgal. This geographical marker is significant. Gilgal was the site where Israel had first camped after crossing the Jordan River under Joshua's leadership. It was a place of historical and spiritual importance associated with covenant renewal and the beginning of the conquest of Canaan. The stone quarries mentioned here may have been the same stones that Joshua had set up as a memorial of God's faithfulness. For A to pass by this location on his way to safety carried symbolic weight. He was in a sense retracing the path of Israel's initial entrance into the Promised Land. He was moving from occupied territory back toward the hill country that remained more fully under Israelite control. He was returning to the place where God's people had first established themselves. And he was doing so having struck blow for liberation, and having acted in a way that echoed the courage and faith of the generation that had first entered the land. Ehud reached the hill country of Ephraim. This was rough, defensible terrain, the kind of landscape where a small force could hold off a larger one, where locals had advantage over invaders, where pursuit became difficult and costly. Ehud was safe here. The Moabites could not easily reach him. Even if they discovered his identity quickly and sent soldiers after him, they would not be able to capture him in this territory without starting a war. They were no longer prepared to fight because Eglon was dead. The king who had held the coalition together, who had maintained the occupation, who had been the center of Moabite power in the region, he was gone, and without him, everything became uncertain. Ehud had succeeded. He had delivered the blow that made deliverance possible. He had struck at the head, and the body was now vulnerable, but deliverance was not yet complete. The Moabite occupation still existed. Their forces still held strategic positions. Their alliance with the Ammonites and Amalekites had not automatically dissolved. The structure of oppression remained even if its architect was dead. What was needed now was collective action. Israel needed to rise. They needed to seize the moment. They needed to act together to finish what had started. And so did not rest. He did not hide. He did not celebrate privately and wait for others to discover what he had done. He took up a trumpet and sounded it across the hills. The shofar blast echoed through the hill country. It was a call to assembly, a signal of urgency, a summons that could not be ignored. People hearing it would know that something significant had happened, that they needed to gather, that action was required, and they came from their homes and fields, from their villages and camps. They came to see what had happened, to hear what message this trumpet carried. Ah was waiting for them. Chapter 7. The Call to Rise. When the people gathered around Ehud in the hill country, he didn't begin with explanations or apologies or request for consensus. He spoke to them with the authority of someone who had already acted, who had already put his own life at risk, who had already changed the situation fundamentally. "Follow me," he said, "for the Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand." This was not a request. It was a declaration. Ehud was not asking permission, and he was not seeking approval. He was announcing a reality that had already begun to unfold and calling the people to participate in it. The phrasing is important. He did not say, "I have killed Eglon." He did not make himself the focus. He said, "The Lord has given your enemies into your hand." This was divine action. This was God's deliverance. Ehud had been the instrument, but the power behind the action was divine, and the people responded. They did not debate. They did not form committees to study the situation. They did not demand evidence or conduct investigations. They simply followed. This response reveals something about the state of Israel at that moment. 18 years of oppression had not destroyed their capacity for collective action. It had not eliminated their willingness to fight for freedom. It had simply left them without leadership, without a clear path forward, without someone to rally around. Ehud provided that leadership not through charisma, not through eloquence, but through action. He had already proven his commitment. He had already demonstrated that deliverance was possible. He had already put his life on the line. And so when he called them to follow, they followed. Israel moved together, descending from the hill country with a unity that had been absent during the years of oppression. They were not a professional army. They were farmers and shepherds, craftsmen and merchants, people who had been living under occupation and were now taking up arms. But they moved with purpose, directed by Ehud toward a specific objective. The objective was strategic and brilliant in its simplicity. They seized the fords of the Jordan River. The fords were the crossing points, the shallow places where the Jordan could be traversed without boats or swimming. In a time before bridges, controlling these fords meant controlling movement between the territory on both sides of the river. And in this situation, it meant controlling the ability of Moabitate forces to retreat to their homeland or to receive reinforcements from it. Ehud understood that killing Eglon was necessary, but not sufficient. The Moabitate occupation included soldiers, administrators, tax collectors, people who are now leaderless and vulnerable, but who could still regroup if given the opportunity. If they could cross the Jordan and return to Moab proper, they could inform their countrymen, organize a response, potentially mount a counteroffensive. The occupation might continue under new leadership, but if the fords were held, if crossing was prevented, then the Moabitate presence in occupied territory was isolated, cut off, unable to retreat, unable to receive help. Israel took the fords and held them. No one was allowed to pass. The routes of escape were closed. The trap was set, and the Moabites, discovering that their king was dead, that their position was now untenable, that they were cut off from their homeland, found themselves in an impossible situation. They could surrender, which would mean captivity or death. They could try to fight their way through to the fords, which would mean facing an aroused and determined Israel on terrain that favored defense. Or they could try to flee in other directions, away from Moab into territory that was even more hostile. Had they chose to fight, it was not a successful choice. Chapter 8. Victory without prolonged war. The text records that about 10,000 Moabitate men fell that day. This is a substantial number. It represents not just soldiers, but the entire military and administrative apparatus of the occupation. These were fighting men, capable men, the kind of forces that had been sufficient to maintain control over occupied territory for 18 years. But they fell. Not because Israel had superior numbers, not because they had better equipment, but because the situation had fundamentally changed. They were leaderless. They were cut off. They were facing people who had been pushed to the breaking point and were now fighting for liberation. The phrase "all robust and strong men" appears in some translations, emphasizing that these were not weak forces. These were capable warriors. But capability is not enough when the strategic situation is against you. When you have no central command, when you cannot retreat, when you are fighting people who have everything to gain and you have everything to lose. Israel struck them down at the fords. The text is clear. Not one escaped. This was complete military victory. The Moabitate presence in occupied territory was eliminated. The forces that had enforced tribute collection, that had maintained checkpoints, that had represented foreign power in the land, they were gone. This was accomplished in a single day. Not through a prolonged military campaign, not through a series of battles over months or years, but through a combination of decisive action by Ehud and collective response by Israel. One man struck at the head. The people struck at the body and the occupation collapsed. The aftermath was not chaos. It was peace. The text records that the land had rest for 80 years. 80 years. Think about what that means. It means that children born after this deliverance would grow up, have children of their own, grow old and die all in a time of peace. It means that an entire human lifetime could pass without the experience of foreign occupation. It means that the freedom won in a single day would last for nearly a century. This rest was not maintained through constant military vigilance. There is no record of Israel having to fight repeated wars with Moab to maintain their independence. The victory was so complete, the shift in power so decisive, that the Moabites simply could not reconstitute the occupation. Without Eglon, and without the coalition he had built, without the forces that had been destroyed at the fords, Moab was no longer a threat to Israel on that scale. The 80 years of rest also suggests something about the internal state of Israel. The cycle of the judges was a cycle of faithfulness and faithlessness. Israel would be faithful, would experience blessing, would then fall into idolatry, would suffer consequences, would cry out, would be delivered, and the pattern would repeat. The fact that the land had rest for 80 years suggests that this particular deliverance led to a period of sustained faithfulness, or at minimum, that the consequences of unfaithfulness did not reach the level of foreign occupation during that time. Ehud himself fades from the narrative after this point. There are no additional stories about him, no further exploits, and no records of his governance or his later years. He delivered Israel, and then he stepped back into the quiet from which he had emerged. This is entirely consistent with his character as the text has presented it. Hood was not someone who sought glory. He was not motivated by a desire for personal power. He understood his role and fulfilled it. And when the role was complete, he did not attempt to leverage his success into a dynasty or a permanent position of authority. Some commentators have suggested that Ehud may have served as a judge in the formal sense, as a leader who provided guidance and settled disputes during the period of peace, but if so, he did it quietly. The text does not emphasize this aspect of his life the way it does for some other judges. His significance lies entirely in the act of deliverance, not in what came after. There is something powerful in this restraint. In a world that constantly pushes people to build on their successes, to play one achievement into the next, to never stop climbing or accumulating or expanding their influence, Ehud's story offers a different model. It suggests that sometimes the task is the task, that completion is enough, that stepping back is not failure but wisdom. The people lived in peace. They experienced the freedom that Ehud's action had made possible. They raised children and planted crops and built homes and lived full lives. And that was the goal. Not Ehud's fame, not Ehud's legacy, but the actual lived experience of freedom for ordinary people. This is what deliverance looks like when it succeeds. Not just the dramatic moment of liberation, but the long, quiet years of peace that follow. The opportunity to live without fear, the ability to keep what you produce, the dignity of self-determination. 80 years of that. All because one man whom the world would have overlooked did what needed to be done. Epilogue: the God who uses the overlooked. The story of Ehud is not the kind of story that typically gets told. It lacks the drama of David facing Goliath. It lacks the spectacle of the Red Sea parting. It lacks the grand speeches and the poetic declarations that fill other parts of Scripture. It is a strange story in many ways, violent, brief, focused on a single act rather than a lifetime of exploits. But that is precisely why it matters. Because most of life is not lived in moments of spectacle. Most of life is lived in the quiet places, in the routines, in the details that seem too small to matter. Most people are not David. They are not Moses. They are not called to part seas or slay giants. They are ordinary, overlooked, living lives that the world considers unremarkable. And this story reminds us that God works in exactly those places through exactly those people. He who was left-handed in his world. This made him different, possibly disadvantaged, certainly unexpected. It was the kind of detail that most people would not even notice. And if they did notice, they would not consider it significant. Who cares which hand someone favors? What does it matter in the grand scheme of things? But God used that difference. He used what others would have seen as a limitation and made it the key to deliverance. The very thing that might have disqualified a hood in human eyes became the reason he could succeed where others would have failed. This is a pattern we see throughout Scripture. God chooses the younger brother, the barren woman, the stuttering prophet, the shepherd boy, the virgin from Nazareth. He chooses people who lack the credentials, who do not fit the profile, who should not be able to accomplish what he calls them to do. And they succeed, not because they were secretly qualified all along, not because they had hidden potential that just needed to be unleashed, but because God's power is made perfect in weakness, because his strength shows most clearly when human strength is absent, because the glory goes to him when the instrument is obviously inadequate. Ehud understood something essential about calling and obedience. And he understood that it is not about being the most capable person in the room. It is not about having the best resume or the most impressive background. It is about being the person God has chosen to act in a particular moment and then acting. There is no record of Ehud doubting, no record of him arguing with God about his qualifications, no record of him saying, "But I am left-handed the way Moses said, but I am slow of speech." Ehud simply did what needed to be done. This is the heart of faithfulness, not the absence of fear, not the presence of overwhelming confidence, but the decision to act in obedience even when the outcome is uncertain, even when the odds seem impossible, even when the world would say you are not the right person for the task. The story also teaches us about the nature of deliverance itself. It came suddenly, unexpectedly, through a plan that relied on the overlooked and the underestimated. It was not the result of a popular uprising. It was not the result of a long military campaign. It was the result of one man doing what needed to be done in the way that only he could do it. But deliverance also required response. Ehud struck the blow, but Israel had to rise. Ehud called and the people had to follow. Both were necessary. Both were part of God's plan. Individual faithfulness created the opportunity. Collective action completed the work. This is a model for how change happens. It requires individuals who are willing to take risks, who are willing to act first, who are willing to do what seems impossible. But it also requires communities who are ready to respond, who are willing to follow, who are willing to put in the work of turning a single act of courage into sustained transformation. Israel got 80 years of peace not because they asked for it, not because they deserved it, but because one man was obedient in a moment and they responded when the moment came. There is comfort in this for anyone who has ever felt overlooked, for anyone who has ever thought they were too different, too limited, too insignificant to be used for something meaningful. The story of Ehud says otherwise. It says that God sees potential where others see limitation. It says that what makes you unusual might be exactly what makes you effective. It says that faithfulness in the moment matters more than recognition in the aftermath. Did not become a king. He did not establish a dynasty. His name does not appear in the genealogies of the great. Most people who know Bible stories have never heard of him. But he gave his people 80 years of peace. He broke the power of an oppressor. He changed the course of history. And he did it quietly without fanfare, without building a legacy for himself. He did what needed to be done, and then he stepped back and let the people live in the freedom he had made possible. There is a lesson here for the way we think about our own lives. We live in a world that celebrates the loud, the visible, the spectacular. We are told that impact requires platform, that significance requires recognition, that if our work is not seen, it does not matter. But this story teaches something different. It teaches that quiet obedience can reshape nations, that a single act of faithfulness can echo through generations, that God's work does not require our fame to be effective. Hood reminds us that we do not need to be the person everyone expects. We only need to be the person God has prepared. And when the moment comes, the moment that is ours that fits the shape of who we are, we act. We act with clarity, with focus, with the understanding that this is not about us. It is about something larger, something that will outlast us, something that will bring freedom to people we may never meet. This is the God who uses the overlooked, the God who works through the unexpected, the God who turns what the world dismisses into the instrument of deliverance, the God who saw a left-handed man and knew exactly what he needed him to do, the God who even now sees you, knows you, and has shaped you for moments you may not yet recognize. You're not too small. Wash, you're not too different. You're not too limited. You're exactly who you need to be, shaped for the moments that are yours. Deliverance often comes unexpectedly, through people the world would never choose, through plans that make no sense until they work, through faithfulness in moments that seem too ordinary to matter, but they do matter. Every act of obedience matters. Every moment of courage matters. Every decision to do what is right. Even when no one is watching, even when no one will remember, even when the recognition will never come, these matter because God sees, God knows, and God works through people who are willing to be used, who are willing to act, who are willing to trust that their differences are not disabilities, but divine design. Yehud delivered Israel, not because he was the obvious choice, not because he fit the profile, but because when the moment came, he was ready. And when he acted, the people responded. And when the work was done, freedom followed. 80 years of it, a lifetime, multiple lifetimes. Peace that lasted because one person was faithful in a single moment. Rest in that tonight. Rest in the knowledge that your life matters more than you know, that your faithfulness has impact beyond what you can see, that the God who worked through a hood works still, and he works through people exactly like you. Sleep well, the story is finished. But its truth continues, and tomorrow when you wake, you will carry with you the reminder that God uses the overlooked, including you, especially you. Hello, dear friend, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know, how has your day been? Whether you're listening to this in the quiet hours of evening, perhaps as the sun sets wherever you are in the world, or if it's late at night and you're ready to rest, I hope you'll find peace in the story we're about to share together. Are you listening from a cozy bedroom in America? Perhaps from a small town in England, or maybe from somewhere across the vast expanses of Australia or Canada? Wherever you are, whatever time zone cradles you tonight, you're welcome here. If this is your first time with Sacred Slumber, I invite you to subscribe so these stories can accompany you through many peaceful nights ahead. Now let's settle in together and journey back to an ancient time, to a small town called Zarephath, where a miracle unfolded that would echo through the ages. The sun blazed mercilessly over the land of Israel, its rays beating down upon cracked earth and withered fields. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen from the brass-cold sky. The rivers had dwindled to dusty beds lined with sun-bleached stones, and the wells that once bubbled with fresh water now echoed hollow when a stone was dropped into their depths. This terrible drought was no accident of nature. It was the judgment of the Almighty God upon a nation that had turned away from him. King Ahab, weak and easily swayed, had married the pagan princess Jezebel, and together they had led Israel into the worship of false gods, Baal, the supposed god of rain and fertility, and Asherah, the goddess of the sea. Golden calves and wooden idols dotted the landscape, where altars to the true God once stood. Into this spiritual darkness had stepped a man unlike any other. Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet wrapped in rough camel's hair, his eyes blazing with the fire of divine purpose. He had confronted King Ahab with words that still rang in the air. As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word. For months after delivering this pronouncement, Elijah had hidden by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan River. There in that secret place, ravens, those dark messengers of the wilderness, brought him bread and meat each morning and evening, while he drank from the brook's clear waters. It was a time of solitude and communion with God. But even this sanctuary could not last forever. Day by day, Elijah watched the brook grow shallower. The musical babbling that had once lulled him to sleep grew quieter until it was barely a whisper. Soon only scattered puddles remained, then mere dampness in the sand, and finally nothing but a dry bed where life-giving water had once flowed. It was then, when human resources failed and earthly security vanished, that the word of the Lord came to Elijah again. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you. Zarephath, the name meant a place of refining, and how fitting it would prove to be. This small Phoenician town nestled along the Mediterranean coast north of Israel was under Gentile rule beyond the borders of the chosen people in a land where Baal and Asher were worshipped openly. Yet it was here in this unlikely place that God would work one of his most tender miracles. So Elijah gathered his simple possessions, his mantle, his staff, and the unwavering faith that had sustained him through these years of drought and hiding. The sun was high as he began his journey northward, his feet raising small clouds of dust from the parched earth. Behind him lay the dried brook and the memories of miraculous provision. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of God's continued care. As he walked, Elijah might have pondered the strangeness of God's ways. Here was a Hebrew prophet, a man who had proclaimed judgment upon Israel for their worship of foreign gods, now being sent to a foreign land, where those very gods were revered. Yet if the years had taught him anything, it was that the Lord's thoughts were higher than his thoughts, and the Lord's ways past finding out. The journey from the Jordan Valley to the coastal region of Zarephath would take several days. Elijah traveled through landscapes scarred by drought, abandoned villages where the wells had run dry, fields where the stubble of failed crops crunched beneath his sandals, and hillsides where olive trees stretched their gnarled branches skyward in silent supplication for rain that would not come. At night he slept under stars that seemed to burn with unusual intensity in the clear, dry air. The moon, when it appeared, cast sharp shadows on the lifeless landscape, and sometimes he could hear in the distance the mournful cry of jackals searching for water in the empty wadis. But even as the physical landscape spoke of judgment and desolation, Elijah's heart remained anchored in hope. The same God who had sent ravens to feed him, who had made water spring from rock for Moses, who had provided manna in the wilderness for the children of Israel, had promised that a widow in Zarephath would care for him. It seemed impossible, even absurd. What widow in this time of famine would have enough to share? Yet Elijah had learned that impossibility was often the very stage upon which God chose to display his glory. On the third day of his journey, the scent of the sea began to reach his nostrils, carried on breezes that offered little relief from the heat, but spoke of his approaching destination. The landscape gradually changed from the brown hills of inland Palestine to the terraced slopes that descended toward the Mediterranean coast. In the distance, he could see the blue expanse of the Great Sea, its surface shimmering like hammered metal under the relentless sun. As he crested the final hill before Zarephath, Elijah paused to survey the town spread below him. It was modest in size, its flat-roofed houses clustered around a small marketplace with narrow streets winding between them, like tributaries of a dry river. The town's walls, though not as grand as those of the great cities, spoke of a community that had weathered many storms. Fishing boats lay pulled up on the beach, their nets spread out to dry. Though in these days of little rain, even the sea seemed less generous with its bounty. Smoke rose from only a few chimneys, a sign that even here, far from Israel, the effects of the drought were being felt. Fuel was precious when every piece of wood might be needed for cooking what little food remained, and families were learning to make do with cold meals and carefully rationed provisions. As Elijah descended the hill toward the town gate, his stomach reminded him that it had been hours since his last meal. The ravens no longer came with their mysterious daily provision, and the bread in his traveling pouch was long since consumed. For the first time in months, the prophet experienced the gnawing uncertainty that had become the constant companion of countless families throughout the region. But even as hunger and weariness pressed upon him, Elijah's step remained steady. Somewhere in this foreign town was a widow whom God had prepared to be his instrument of provision. The prophet did not know her name, her face, or her circumstances. He knew only that the Lord had spoken, and that was enough. The sun was now approaching at zenith as Elijah neared the gates of Zarephath, his shadow, a small dark pool at his feet. Soon, very soon, he would meet the woman through whom God intended to demonstrate that his care extends beyond all human boundaries, his provision beyond all human understanding, and his power beyond even the finality of death itself. The stage was set for a miracle that would begin with a simple request for water and a piece of bread, but would culminate in wonders that neither the prophet nor the widow could have imagined. In this place of refining, in this encounter between a Hebrew man of God and a Gentile woman of faith, the character of the Almighty would be revealed in ways both tender and magnificent. The gates of Zarephath stood open in the midday heat, their wooden beams weathered and worn by countless seasons of sun and storm. As Elijah approached, he could see that the usual bustle of a town entrance was notably absent. No merchants haggled over goods, no children played in the dust, no elders sat in the shade discussing the affairs of the day. The drought and its accompanying famine had drained the life from this place, leaving behind only the essential movements of survival. Elijah's throat was parched from his long journey, and his lips were cracked from the dry air. Each step sent small puffs of dust up from the hard-packed earth, and the prophet found himself scanning the area, hopefully for any sign of a well or fountain. His eyes, accustomed to the blazing light of the Palestinian sun, squinted as he tried to make out the details of his surroundings. It was then that he noticed her. Just outside the town gates, near a grove of scraggly olive trees that had somehow managed to survive the prolonged drought, a woman was bent over, methodically gathering fallen sticks and dead branches. Her movements were slow and deliberate, speaking not of laziness, but of the careful conservation of energy that comes from prolonged hunger. Her clothing, once perhaps a deep blue or brown, had faded to the nondescript color of dust and wear, patched in several places with fabric that didn't quite match. As Elijah drew closer, he could see that she was neither young nor old, but somewhere in that middle season of life, where a woman's beauty becomes less about the freshness of youth and more about the character etched in her features by joy and sorrow, hope and disappointment. Her dark hair, stray with premature gray that spoke of hardship born before its time, was partially covered by a worn headscarf that had slipped back as she worked. There was something in her posture, a weariness that seemed to go beyond physical exhaustion that made Elijah's heart stir with compassion. This was a woman who had carried burdens, who had made hard choices, who had watched her resources dwindle day by day until she was reduced to gathering sticks in the heat of the day. The prophet paused for a moment, studying her face as she worked. In her features, he could read the story of the drought's impact on ordinary people. Her cheeks were hollow, her eyes shadowed with the particular kind of worry that comes from watching a child grow thin. Yet there was also a quiet dignity about her, a refusal to surrender to despair, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. "Excuse me," Elijah called softly, his voice rough from thirst and travel. The woman looked up startled. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the appearance of this stranger. His rough clothing, his weathered features, the staff in his hand that marked him as a traveler from far away. In her gaze, Elijah could see the weariness that had become second nature to people in these hard times. Strangers might bring news, trade, or help, but they might also bring additional mouths to feed when food was already desperately scarce. "Please," Elijah continued, his manner gentle and respectful, "could you bring me a little water in a cup that I may drink?" The request hung in the air between them. Water in this time of drought was precious beyond measure. Every drop had to be carried from wells that were increasingly distant and depleted. Yet something in the prophet's manner, perhaps the genuine need in his voice, or the courtesy with which he had made his request, caused the woman to hesitate rather than refuse outright. She studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read his character and his features. What she saw there must have reassured her, for she slowly straightened, her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms. "I will bring you water," she said simply, her voice carrying the accent of this coastal region, but also a warmth that suggested a heart not yet hardened by suffering. As she turned toward the town, Elijah felt a stirring of gratitude here in this foreign place. This Gentile woman was willing to share her precious water with a Hebrew stranger. It was a small act of kindness, but in a world grown harsh with want, small kindnesses took on the weight of great acts of mercy. But the Lord had sent him here for more than water, and Elijah knew that his true test and hers was yet to come. "Wait," he called gently as she began to walk away, "and please bring me a morsel of bread in your hand." The woman stopped as if struck. She turned back to him, and now her face bore an expression of such profound sadness that Elijah felt his heart constrict. The weariness he had noticed before was nothing compared to the look of desperate finality that now clouded her features. "As the Lord your God lives," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only a crushing weariness and the terrible honesty of someone who has nothing left to lose. "I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. See, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." The words fell between them like stones dropping into a deep well. This was not the casual refusal of someone unwilling to share, nor the calculated response of someone hoarding resources. This was the stark reality of a mother who had come to the end of all earthly hope, who had measured her remaining provisions with the careful precision of someone planning a final meal. Elijah felt the weight of her despair, but he also felt the stirring of something else, the peculiar lifting of spirit that came when he sensed the Lord was about to move in power. How often had he seen this pattern? The moment when human resources failed completely was precisely the moment when divine intervention began. "Do not fear," he said, and his voice carried a new authority, a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his own understanding. The words were not merely a comfort, but a command spoken with the certainty of someone who had learned to recognize the voice of the Almighty. The woman's eyes widened at the change in his tone. Something had shifted in the stranger's demeanor, as if he had suddenly remembered who he was and whom he served. "Go and do as you have said," Elijah continued, "but make me a small cake from it first, and bring it to me, and afterward, make some for yourself and your son." The request seemed almost cruel in its audacity. Here was a woman who had just confessed that she and her child were preparing to eat their last meal before death, and this stranger was asking her to give him the first portion. By any human standard of fairness or compassion, the request was outrageous. But Elijah was not speaking from human wisdom. Now he was speaking as one who had learned to see beyond the visible, to understand that sometimes the pathway to blessing required actions that seemed to defy common sense. "For thus says the Lord God of Israel," he proclaimed, and now his voice carried the full weight of prophetic authority. "The bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The promise hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. On one side stood the widow's desperate reality: empty bins, empty jars, and the approaching specter of death. On the other side stood the word of a God she barely knew, spoken through a stranger whose only credentials were the conviction in his voice and the authority with which he spoke. The woman stared at him, her mind undoubtedly racing. Everything I in her experience told her that flour and oil once consumed were gone forever. Everything she had learned about the world spoke against the possibility of vessels that never emptied, of resources that renewed themselves. She had no reason to trust this foreigner, no evidence that his God was any more real or powerful than the gods her neighbors worshipped. Yet something in his eyes, something in the absolute certainty with which he had spoken, gave her pause. She had lived long enough to recognize truth when she heard it, even when that truth seemed to contradict everything she thought she knew about the world. The choice before her was stark and simple, yet it carried implications that reached far beyond the immediate moment. She could refuse, clinging to what little she had, and eat her final meal with her son in the privacy of her own home. Or she could trust stepping out in faith toward a promise that seemed too wonderful to believe, risking the immediate needs of her child on the word of a stranger's God. As she stood there in the dusty street of Zarephath, with her bundle of sticks still clutched in her arms and the prophet's words echoing in her mind, the widow found herself at one of those crossroads that define a life. Her next decision would determine not only whether she and her son lived or died, but whether they would become part of a story that would be told for generations to come. A story of faith rewarded, of divine provision, and of the God who sees beyond the boundaries that divide nations and peoples. The sun beat down upon them both as she weighed her choice, but in that moment of decision, neither the heat nor the hunger, nor the desperate circumstances seemed to matter. All that mattered was whether she would choose to believe that the impossible might just possibly be true. The widow stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity, though in reality it was perhaps only the span of a few heartbeats. In that suspended moment, the entire universe seemed to be waiting for her decision. The very air around them felt charged with possibility, as if creation itself was holding its breath to see whether faith would triumph over fear, whether hope would overcome the stark mathematics of survival. Elijah watched her face carefully, seeing the battle that raged within her soul. He had delivered the word of the Lord as he had been commanded, but now the choice was hers alone to make. The prophet knew from long experience that God's miracles often hinged not on human understanding, but on human obedience, not on the ability to see how a promise might be fulfilled, but on the willingness to act as if it already had been. The woman's eyes moved from Elijah's face to the bundle of sticks in her arms, then toward the town gates where her small home awaited. where her son was undoubtedly waiting for her return, probably listening for the sound of her footsteps. It would signal the beginning of their final meal together. She thought of his thin face, his two bright eyes that spoke of a child who had learned too young what it meant to be hungry, and her heart clenched with the fierce protectiveness of motherhood. Yet something else stirred within her as well, a memory perhaps of stories she had heard as a child about the God of the Hebrews, the one who was said to part seas and rain bread from heaven. Or perhaps it was simpler than that, nothing more than the recognition that she'd already lost everything that could be lost. And in that place of complete surrender, there was a strange kind of freedom. "I will do as you have said," she whispered finally, her voice so quiet that Elijah had to lean forward to hear her words. The decision once made seemed to infuse her with new energy. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her grip on the bundle of sticks, and began walking toward the town gates with a purpose that had been absent from her movements before. Elijah followed at a respectful distance, marveling at the courage it must have taken for her to choose trust over terror, faith over the apparent facts of her situation. The narrow streets of Zarephath were largely empty in the heat of midday, but the few people they encountered looked at the odd pair with curiosity. The widow, known to her neighbors as a woman facing starvation, was walking with determined steps beside a foreign stranger whose very presence seemed to radiate an unusual intensity. Word would spread quickly through the small community that something unusual was happening at the house of the widow woman. Her home, when they reached it, was modest, even by the standards of a fishing town. The flat-roof dwelling was built of the local stone, its walls weathered by countless seasons of Mediterranean storms. A small courtyard in front contained an outdoor oven that had seen little use in recent weeks, its stones cold and covered with a fine layer of dust. A few clay pots stood in the shade, and a wooden door worn, smooth by years of use, led into the main room of the house. As they approached, the door opened, and a boy appeared, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, with his mother's dark eyes and hair. His frame was thin in the way that spoke of prolonged hunger, but his face lit up with genuine joy at seeing his mother return. That joy dimmed slightly as he noticed a stranger accompanying her, replaced by the cautious curiosity of a child who had learned to be wary of unexpected changes in routine. "Mother," he said, his voice carrying a question that encompassed much more than the single word could express. The widow reached out and touched her son's face gently, a gesture that spoke of infinite tenderness and perhaps also a farewell. "This is Elijah, a prophet of the Lord God of Israel," she said simply. "We're going to prepare food and he will eat with us." The boy's eyes widened. In their current circumstances, sharing food with anyone, even a guest, represented an act of generosity that bordered on the impossible. Yet he had learned to trust his mother's judgment. And if she said this man would eat with them, then somehow it would be so. Inside the house was cool and dim, a welcome relief from the blazing heat outside. The main room served as both a living area and kitchen, with sleeping quarters in a small adjoining chamber. Clay storage jars lined one wall, most of them standing empty like silent witnesses to the family's dwindling resources. Only two containers held anything of value: a small bin that contained the handful of flour the widow had mentioned, and an equally small jar that held the last precious drops of oil. The widow set down her bundle of sticks and began the familiar ritual of preparing a fire. She arranged the wood carefully in the outdoor oven, knowing that every stick must count, every flame must serve its purpose. As she worked, Elijah and the boy watched in respectful silence, each lost in his own thoughts about what was about to unfold. When the fire was burning steadily, the widow went to retrieve her flour and oil. She opened the bin and looked inside. seeing the meager handful of grain that represented all that stood between her family and starvation. For a moment, her resolve wavered. The practical voice of experience whispered that she was being foolish, that she was about to sacrifice her child's last meal on the word of a stranger. But then she remembered the authority in Elijah's voice when he had spoken his promise, the absolute certainty that had rung in his words like a bell struck in a clear mountain air. She had heard many people speak in her lifetime, merchants making promises they wouldn't keep, neighbors offering help they couldn't deliver, officials making proclamations that meant nothing. This had been different. This had carried the weight of truth, spoken by someone who knew the one who held the universe in his hands. With steady hands, she measured out the flour, not all of it, but enough to make a small loaf as Elijah had requested. She added the precious oil, drop by careful drop, then water from their dwindling supply. As she kneaded the dough, she found herself praying to the God of Israel, a God she knew only by reputation, but whom she was now trusting with everything she held dear. The bread baked quickly in the hot oven, filling the small courtyard with an aroma that made all their mouths water and their stomachs clench with longing. When it was finished, golden brown and still steaming, the widow placed it on a wooden plate and carried it to where Elijah sat waiting. "Here," she said simply, offering him the bread that might well be the last her household would ever eat. Elijah received the loaf with the gravity it deserved, understanding that he held in his hands not just food, but an act of faith that would echo through eternity. He broke it carefully, offering portions to both the widow and her son before taking any for himself. The bread was simple, fair, coarse flour, baked with skill born of necessity, but it tasted like the finest feast to three people who had known real hunger. As they ate, a comfortable silence settled over the small courtyard. The bread satisfied their immediate hunger, but more than that, it seemed to nourish something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or the peculiar peace that comes from taking a step of faith and finding solid ground beneath one's feet. When the meal was finished, the inevitable moment arrived. The widow rose to check her storage containers, knowing that according to every law of nature and economy, they should now be empty. The flour bin should contain nothing but dust and remnants. The oil jar, nothing but the stained clay at its bottom. She opened the flour bin first, and her breath caught in her throat. Where she had expected to find emptiness, there was flour, not the handful that had remained before, but the same amounts that had been there that morning. Her hands trembled as she reached into the jar, running the grain through her fingers to assure herself that she was not dreaming. Next came the oil jar. She lifted it carefully, feeling its weight, while hearing the liquid slosh against the sides. It was full as it had been when she had first measured out the precious oil for their bread. "Mother," her son whispered, seeing the wonder and disbelief that played across her features. "The word of the Lord is true," she breathed, her voice filled with awe. "The flour and oil have not diminished. They're just as they were before." From that day forward, the miracle continued. Each morning, the widow would wake expecting to find her containers empty, only to discover them filled with the same amounts they had held the day before. She would measure out flour for the day's bread, pour oil for cooking, and use what was needed to sustain her household and their guest. But each time she checked, morning, noon, and evening, the levels remained constant, as if invisible hands were replenishing what had been taken. Word of the miracle spread slowly through Zarephath. Neighbors who had expected to attend a funeral instead saw smoke rising daily from the widow's oven. They saw the boy playing in the courtyard with more energy than he had shown in months. They saw the foreign prophet living in their midst, his presence somehow bringing blessing rather than burden to the household that sheltered him. Some whispered that it was sorcery. others that the gods were showing favor to the widow for her kindness to strangers. But the widow herself knew better. She had witnessed firsthand the power of the God of Israel, the one who could multiply resources that seemed exhausted, who could bring abundance from scarcity, who could sustain life when death seemed certain. As weeks turned into months, the relationship between the widow, her son, and Elijah deepened into something like family. The prophet helped with daily tasks, told stories of his journeys and the wonders he had witnessed, and taught them both about the nature and character of the God he served. The boy, who had never known a father's presence, began to look up to Elijah with the mixture of respect and affection that a son shows to a beloved elder. For his part, Elijah found in this simple household something he had rarely experienced in his years of prophetic ministry, the warmth of ordinary human fellowship. Here, far from the palaces and temples where he usually delivered his messages, he discovered the profound joy of seeing God's love expressed through daily provision. Through the laughter of a child who was no longer hungry, through the grateful smile of a woman who had learned to trust in the impossible, the jar and jug that never emptied became more than just a miracle of physical provision. They became symbols of a deeper truth, that the God of Israel was not limited by human boundaries, that his love extended beyond the chosen people to encompass all who would trust in him, that his power was sufficient to meet every need of those who placed their faith in his promises. In the small house in Zarephath, as the drought continued to devastate the surrounding lands, a different kind of abundance flourished. It was an abundance measured not just in flour and oil, but in faith rewarded, hope restored, and the quiet joy of lives sustained by the inexhaustible love of the Almighty. The seasons had begun to change in the way they do even during the harshest droughts, with subtle shifts in the angle of sunlight and the patterns of wind that speak to those who know how to listen. Elijah had now been living in the widow's household for many months, and what had begun as a desperate act of faith had settled into a rhythm of daily miracle. Each morning brought the same wonder: jars that should have been empty, filled with provision, hope renewed with the rising of the sun. The boy had grown stronger during this time, his cheeks regaining some of their childhood roundness, his eyes bright with the vitality that comes from adequate nourishment. He had become Elijah's shadow, an eager student, hanging on every word the prophet spoke about the wonders of God, helping with small tasks around the house, and bringing a lightness to their days that reminded all of them what joy looked like. His laughter had become one of the most precious sounds in that small courtyard, pure and musical, the kind of laughter that makes adults remember what it felt like to see the world as a place of infinite possibility. When he played with the wooden toys he had carved under Elijah's guidance, when he helped his mother tend their small herb garden, when he sat listening to stories of lions' dens and burning bushes, the boy radiated the particular happiness of a child who knows he is loved and secure. And the widow, too, had blossomed during these months of miraculous provision. The constant worry that had carved lines around her eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet confidence that spoke of faith tested and proven true. She had learned to trust not just in the daily renewal of flour and oil, but in the character of the God who provided them. Her relationship with Elijah had evolved from desperate gratitude to genuine friendship, seasoned with the deep respect she held for his calling and his God. In the evenings, when the heat of the day had passed, the three of them would often sit together in the courtyard, watching the stars emerge in the clear sky. Elijah would tell them stories of his people's history, of Abraham's faith, of Moses' courage, of David's psalms, and gradually the widow and her son came to understand that they were not merely recipients of divine charity, but participants in a story much larger than themselves. It was during one of these peaceful evening conversations that the boy first began to cough. At first it seemed like nothing, perhaps a bit of dust in the throat or the dry air that had been their constant companion throughout the drought. The widow offered him water, and he drank gratefully, the coughing subsiding as quickly as it had begun. They thought nothing more of it and continued their conversation about the time when Elijah had called down fire from heaven to consume a sacrifice on Mount Carmel. But the next morning the boy woke with a flush in his cheeks that spoke of fever rather than health. His mother noticed immediately, the way mothers always do, and pressed her palm to his forehead with the practiced concern of one who had nursed many childhood illnesses. He was warm, not dangerously so, but enough to cause worry. "It's nothing serious," she assured Elijah when she saw the concern in the prophet's eyes. "Children often take fevers during the changing of seasons. I have herbs that will help, and with rest he'll be well in a few days." Elijah nodded, but something in his spirit was troubled. He had learned over his years of walking with God to pay attention to such stirrings, even when they seemed to contradict the evidence of his natural senses. Still, he kept his concerns to himself and joined the widow, intending to the boy with all the skill and care they could muster. For 2 days the illness seemed manageable. The boy remained in bed, accepting the herbal teas his mother prepared, sleeping more than usual, but still able to sit up and take some nourishment. His fever rose and fell in the typical pattern of childhood ailments, and there were moments when he seemed almost his normal self, asking Elijah to tell him again about the ravens that had brought bread and meat to the brook Cherith. But on the third morning, something changed. The boy's breathing became labored, and his fever spiked higher than before. His eyes, when he managed to open them, seemed to look through rather than at the people who bent over him with growing concern. The flush in his cheeks deepened to an alarming red, and his small body trembled with chills that no amount of blankets could warm. The widow worked with desperate efficiency, trying every remedy she knew. She brewed stronger teas from the herbs that had always worked before, applied cool cloths to bring down the fever, and held her son close when the chills made him shake uncontrollably. But despite all her efforts, his condition continued to deteriorate. Elijah found himself in a terrible position. He was a prophet accustomed to speaking with divine authority about the will of God. Yet here he felt helpless in the face of a child suffering. He prayed earnestly, seeking guidance, seeking healing, seeking any word from the Lord about what was happening and why. But the heavens seemed silent, offering no immediate answer to his urgent petitions. By the fourth day, the boy could barely keep his eyes open. His breathing had become so shallow that both his mother and Elijah found themselves leaning close just to assure themselves that he was still alive. The widow had not slept in 2 nights, maintaining a constant vigil beside her son's bed, and the strain was beginning to show in every line of her face. "Perhaps," she said to Elijah during one of the boy's brief periods of peaceful sleep, "perhaps we should send for the physician from the next town. I know we have little to pay him with, but surely the physicians have no more power over this illness than we do." Elijah replied gently, "This is not a sickness that earthly medicine can cure." The words hung between them, carrying implications that neither wanted to fully acknowledge. If earthly medicine could not help, if the herbs and treatments that had always worked before were proving useless, then they were facing something beyond the normal course of illness and recovery. They were facing the possibility that God might be calling this beloved child home. On the fifth morning, as the sun rose with its customary indifference to human suffering, the inevitable happened. The widow, who had dozed fitfully in her chair beside the bed, was awakened by a silence that was somehow more alarming than any sound could have been. She looked at her son and knew immediately that something fundamental had changed. His face, which had been flushed with fever, was now pale and still. His chest no longer rose and fell with the rhythm of breathing. The boy was gone. The widow's scream of anguish pierced the morning air, a sound so raw and primal that it seemed to tear through the very fabric of hope itself. She gathered her son's lifeless body into her arms, rocking back and forth as tears streamed down her face. "What have you done to me, O man of God?" she cried, turning to Elijah with eyes blazing with grief and accusation. "Have you come to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?" The words struck Elijah like physical blows. Here was a woman who had trusted him, who had shared her last meal based on his promise, who had opened her home to him for months. And now, in the presence of God's prophet, her only child lay dead. Without a word, Elijah gently took the boy from his mother's arms. "Give me your son," he said quietly. And despite her grief, something in his tone made her release her hold on the child. Elijah carried the boy to the upper room where he had been staying, laying him carefully on the bed. Then he fell upon his face before God, crying out with all the passion of his prophetic calling, "O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son?" 3 times Elijah stretched himself upon the child, calling out each time, "O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into eternity. Then, like the first breath of dawn, after the longest night, the boy's chest rose. His eyes fluttered open, clear and bright, and he looked up at Elijah with wonder. "Teacher," he whispered, his voice weak, but unmistakably alive. Elijah gathered the boy in his arms, his own eyes wet with tears of joy and gratitude. "Come," he said, "let us go to your mother." When the widow saw her son walking down the stairs alive and whole, she fell to her knees. "Now by this I know that you are a man of God," she declared through her tears, "and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." The miracle at Zarephath teaches us profound truths that echo through the ages. First, we learn about faith in scarcity, how the widow trusted God's promise even when her cupboards were bare and death seemed certain. Her willingness to give from her need rather than her abundance shows us that God often asks us to step forward in faith before we can see how he will provide. Second, we see the power of obedience before understanding. The widow didn't need to comprehend how flour and oil could multiply. She simply needed to trust the word of the Lord and act upon it. Blessings flowed not because she understood the miracle, but because she believed in the one who promised it. Third, this story reveals God's care beyond all boundaries. Here was a Hebrew prophet ministered to by a Gentile widow, showing that God's love transcends nationality, culture, and religion. The miracle in Zarephath foreshadowed the day when God's salvation would be offered to all nations. Finally, through Elijah's intercession for the dead boy, we glimpse God's ultimate power over life and death itself. This miracle points forward to the resurrection, hope that would one day be fully revealed in Christ, reminding us that with God, even death is not the final word. As our story draws to a close, I invite you to consider the empty jars in your own life, those places where resources seem exhausted, where hope feels depleted, where you wonder if God sees your need. The widow of Zarephath discovered that the God of impossible things delights in filling what appears empty, in multiplying what seems insufficient, in bringing life where death has reigned. Perhaps tonight, as you prepare for rest, you can release your own impossibilities into his capable hands. Trust that the same God who filled flour jars and oil vessels in ancient Zarephath is still working miracles today. Sometimes dramatic and visible, sometimes quiet and hidden, but always rooted in his unchanging love for his children. The sun has set over that ancient town by the sea, and a gentle breeze stirs the olive trees, where a widow once gathered sticks in desperation and found instead a destiny of faith. In that small house, the jars remained full. The boy grew strong, And then three hearts learn to trust in the God of endless provision. May you rest tonight knowing that your own story is being written by the same loving hand, and that tomorrow's provision is already prepared by the one who never fails to keep his promises. Sleep well, dear friend, and remember with God the jar never truly empties, and hope is always renewable.